Hello everyone. Now, a while back before VCT Champions started, we did a final end of the season VCT Pacific rankings of all the teams so far. And in that video, I think I mentioned that we might revisit this just because we didn't spend as much time talking about the teams that didn't make it to Champions, since we were kind of gearing up, looking forward to Champions and the 4 teams that made it there. And in that process, I think I mentioned on stream a couple times that, the rankings might change after Champions from what I've seen and things like that. Now, I just want to put this out straight ahead. We're not actually going to redo those rankings. I've taken a look at it, and quite frankly, I don't really have any problems with it. Sure, you could always argue 1 or 2 placements switching back and forth, but I don't think that that's quite necessary, especially just because now Roster Mania is kicking off right away. I mean, things are just firing on all cylinders, and also things have already gotten a bit crazy because we've said goodbye to our first VCT Pacific team. So with Bleed being out of the picture, it's like, okay, well, I don't know if there's as much point in revisiting all those teams individually. However, there have been some questions floating around ever since VCT Ascension Pacific. And that big question is will Prisa Gaming be competitive in 2025? Will they be able to put up a fight against the best teams in the top tier of VCT Pacific? And it's an interesting question just because SPG, I mean, they've been showcasing really fun gameplay. They've shown us one of the best, if not the best, finals we've ever seen alongside BOOM Esports for the grand finals of Ascension Pacific. And they also seem to be willing to try to get ahead of the meta. They are willing to innovate. I mean, this team seems to have everything in loads in terms of being a fun team to follow and watch, but does that make them competitive when they go up against the stronger teams? And now, I guess a similar question could be asked for BOOM Esports, since they've now been promoted, since Bleed Esports has been removed. And so we're going to take a look at that question just pretty briefly today. Is, okay, if we were to take the teams we had in VCT Pacific in 2024 at the end of the season, right? Those rosters, I know rosters are changing. This is being recorded right before the transfer window opens, but I'm sure things will be firing on all cylinders right away. But if those rosters stayed together, if they played in their last form that we saw them at the end of 2024, but, maybe metas change, etc. in 2025, if they were to play against each other, where would SPG rank? And also, where would BOOM Esports rank amongst the existing VCT Pacific teams? Well, let's take a look. So on the left, you see my, end of the season final 2024 rankings of all the VCT Pacific teams. It says roster because, again, it's a reminder that we're taking a look at the rosters they had at the end of 2024 in the last form that we saw them, and how that would rank up against SPG. So let's start at the bottom and see just how far these teams will go. DFM. Listen, I mean, May's amazing, but let's just say it like it is. I think May and Dombi, listen, I'm willing to give May the edge, okay? Dombi looks amazing, especially as Neon. I mean, I would say just in terms of Neon, like, Dombi is definitely ahead, but aside from that, I'll give May the edge, right? He's had the hype riding behind him since Challenger Japan, and I would say individually he proved himself this year in VCT Pacific. But the remaining 4 members, to be brutally honest, I'm pretty sure I would rate all 4 other members of SPG clearly ahead of the 4 other members of DFM. And I think the game's already over at that point, right? I mean, on top of that, SPG seem coordinated. They're not sending Dombi in on his own. Like, even with the Neon, this team is playing up to pace where the fault lines and the Prowlers are all kind of going ahead of him, making sure it's clearing the way. Sure, there are heroics every now and then, but, those are those X Factor rounds, in my opinion. And so the team play is there for SPG. I would say that they have a better grasp of the meta. I would say that they have a deeper playbook. And also the way SPG plays, right? It's kind of like, okay, when we're on the attack, we know we have the numbers advantage anyway. So instead of playing like info and all that macro, we're just going to go in, barrel through, and then force you to play, retake. But we're going to save a lot of this delay util. And so most likely then DFM is going to revert back to like, hey, May, go kill. And sure, he might still get like double kills and things like that, but SPG have a real good grasp on that spike timer. I don't think there's too much reason to spend more time on this one. I think SPG definitely taking a W if they were to play a best of 3 against DFM. Now, Zeta Division. it doesn't really get any better. Sure, they put Huron back on the Sentinel by the end of the year, and it looked a lot better. He looked a lot more comfortable, and that seemed to ease off the pressure for some of the veterans like Depp as well. And so, yes, they looked a little bit better, and therefore maybe a bit pacier than the past. But that's a very low bar to clear, right? ZETA used to be one of the slowest teams we had in VCT Pacific. So off of that, I think SPG just being able to shove the tempo against them nonstop would give them a massive edge. On top of that, sure, I mean, Depp, very, very skilled. You know, I don't think SPG is going to roll over a player like Depp, but I take a look at the people who SPG would be targeting, right? I mean, SPG is usually the one pushing a lot of the times. They're one putting the pressure on, whether it's on attack or defense. So we're talking, they're running into players like Huron, Sugar Zero, things like that. And I don't know if those players are consistently getting like 2 people, minimum 1, if not 2 people every time, you know, taking them with them to make sure the numbers stay even. The pacing, again, the coordination, and again, just even having like a pretty distinct weak spot on the roster. You know, players like Huron, listen, they're young. If you see something in them, I'm all for it. I'm willing to give them a little bit more time and benefit of the doubt, but there is no doubt that they were a weak spot. I mean, same with Huron when he wasn't playing Sentinel. So I think SPG takes the lead there. And I would say, even though they've gotten pacier, at the end of the day, ZETA is still a team that likes to play off of info, right? They like to kind of play a gentleman's agreement type of Valorant, where it's like, all right, you have a default, we have a default. Like, you get info, we get info, and now it's like now it becomes this chess match, which is cool. Like, I'm all for that. But SPG, they have no regard for that. So SPG definitely taking a W here if they play a best of 3, in my opinion. The story continues somewhat similarly. GE. I just want to take this chance to go back and say I do think that the 2024 roster of GE actually had some good ideas. I think they were one of the teams that had some good ante. They had some good prep against their opponents. They had some good ideas. And they're the epitome of everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And some of the ideas they showed were cool. Like some of the setups, some of the reads they had from round to round. It's like, okay, these guys analyze the pattern of their opponents real well, but the execution was always just lacking. And I hate to summarize it this way because this was kind of the shtick that everyone had for GE at the beginning of the year, and the team came out and said, like, firepower, that's not going to be a problem. And so I would have loved to, you know, look back and be like, you know what, we were all wrong. Firepower wasn't the problem. But the reality is firepower was the problem. Now, that doesn't mean that these players can't shoot. I mean, let's say you do a 1v1 tournament in Pacific, the GE players might all be near the top. Like, that doesn't matter, quite frankly. They could be 1 through 5 and it doesn't matter, because if you can't translate your firepower, whether it's in a 1v1 situation or whether it's in scrims, into official team matches, that's the firepower that we all see, right? So the reason could be like a mental block, it could be comms, it could be a number of things, but at the end of the day, you weren't able to showcase it. And that's a big problem against a team like SPG, right? Teams that have a bit of that W gaming flavor, those just roll over you if you can't fire back. And so you might have the right reads. And the thing is SPG, they don't even play like complicated macro, right? They just say, okay, we stack here, we push, we get info, and then we rotate once if we need to. Same thing on defense, right? We get a little bit of info, we push out, and then we stack, we push out, we get ready for the fight. I mean, these guys are ready to fight every time. And so I don't see a world where GE is able to combat that. Now, the way I'm talking about him, you might be wondering, why did Chobra originally rank them higher than Zeta Division? And if you're really curious, you could go back and watch that video where we did the rankings. But the end of the matter is I still rated the team prep and the ideas that they had a little bit higher, right? Zeta was so lost for the majority of the year that, to me, I had really lost a lot of faith about that team. And so that was one of the big reasons. Well, since we are just doing, hey, if the team stayed together and they continue to compete in their last form, what do they look like? I guess we will talk about the team that is no longer with us. Bleed Esports. Another team where really we only got to see, in my opinion, 1 or 2 glimpses of what they could have been, right? Once the pressure was off. once they were able to play a bit more loosely, once they had nothing to lose, literally. You know, Darion gets his ace, things like that. They seem to settle in a little bit more. They seem to play a lot more confidently. And it's a darn shame because who knows? Was that a one-off thing? I mean, like DFM had that moment earlier on in the year and then they didn't quite deliver for the rest of the year. So it's hard to say if that, you know, if the final 1 or 2 matches would continue for Bleed all throughout, you know, the future if they had stuck together. I don't know, but let's work off of what we saw. Darion getting pretty comfy, getting very confident, and showcasing that, you know, there's a reason a lot of people had a lot of hopes for him. There's a reason he stuck around, you know, Bleed stuck with him for so long. You know, that's great. And I would say actually that this team, if they stuck together, again, the pieces are pretty good, right? You have a really solid kind of anchor and passive type of player in Scary. And then you have players like Zest and Crazy Guy who are great initiators, who have really good reads on timings and some good, I would say, anti-prep as well in the opponent's tendencies. So you pair those type of like info-based initiator players, right, who have really good reads on timings. Then you take someone like Scary, who, you know, has a great mind, a little bit more passive, but likes to play a little bit more of the mind games, right? Likes to play a little bit more patiently, things like that. It's a good match, and it could be a good team. Then you have Darion, who, you know, push comes to shove, can get a little bit aggressive if he has that confidence. He can opt quite well, as we saw. There's no doubt about that. And I would say Retla, you know, grew a little bit over the course of the year. Nothing to write home about, but, you know, he does the job. And so it's not a bad team, but the problem is SPG is a team that has no regard for info play. You know, if you want to go off of timings every 20 seconds to figure out what the map looks like, well, SPG is going to say, well, you only really get 2 shots of that because then the round's going to be over and the spike's going to be planted. And now you're probably going to have to wait on those cooldowns to go for the retake. And so stylistically already, I would say SPG gets the edge here. On top of that, in terms of firepower, yes, Bleed had a bunch of players that are talented, but again, talented individually versus talented and coordinating live on the fly at a tempo that's like over 11, SPG takes the cake here. This is where things get a little bit interesting, right? We enter T1, so we enter the mid-range teams that we had in Pacific in 2024. T1, okay, I'm just going to say this. I think SPG wins this. I'm going to say the conclusion first. I think SPG wins this in a best of 3, but T1 has some pieces that actually work really well against a team like SPG. They have 2 great flex initiators that love to fight, and they know how to fight with an advantage, right? To create advantages. Stacks and Carpe, right? Both of them love their pot flashes. They love to say, hey, we're going to take this skirmish and try to take them out. You know how to rely on the aim. Therefore, the team has some good spacing when it comes to these skirmishes, right? The 3v3s, the 4v4s, things like that. It's really solid. By the end of the year, they seem to lean heavily towards Izu on the Duelist. That's where he looks comfortable. That's great. He still has a little bit of going off on his own type of deal, but overall, I would say that's a good place to be. Now, by the end, that meant that Izu mostly playing Duelist leads to Obscurate filling smokes, which wasn't great, and then Saya on Sentinel or other flexes, which was also not great. But I will say that Saya is such a sharpshooter that, let's say he expands his agent pool to like only Cypher or only Killjoy, it still would have been enough, in my opinion, for him to always take 1 or 2 with him if SPG were to run up against him. He's so talented. And then on top of that, the rest of the team really likes to fight. However, map understanding, meta understanding, things like that, sure, if we gave them time, who knows how much T1 could have grown. But like, again, that's a lot of hypotheses. So we're taking a look at like last form T1 and last form SPG. Like SPG is way ahead in that front, right? As a team, they're way more ahead. I would say they're a lot more coordinated. And the thing is I think SPG would still find themselves having a numbers advantage in a lot of these skirmishes. I'm going to say, and Excurate smokes, him as a controller just wasn't really working out. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give SPG the edge here. I think in a best of 3, they win, but this is one of those games where it just takes 1 or 2 clutch rounds from players like Stacks or Carpe, for T1 to be able to clutch it out. And I think you can't ignore that veterancy, right? I would say that starting from rank 7 and above is where the veterancy really starts to come into action, because these are teams that either as a team or have, a majority of their players, right, their core, have experience in growing for the better at the highest level. So this is what I mean. The difference is like the bottom 4 teams, the reason to me that these are unfortunate teams is because they've never really figured out how to grow, right? They're kind of still floundering around and hopefully not building bad habits, but they're not exactly building good habits. Meanwhile, T1 and above, now T1 as a team this year, not exactly building good habits. But then you look at the individual members like Stacks. I mean, he knows how to grow. He knows how to continue to try to reach higher. He knows how to play against better and better and better players because he's been to so many internationals. Saya has a wealth of experience himself as well. Carpe, I would say, has a wealth of that experience from, previous games as well. I mean, this is a team, same with Excurate. Like, this is a team that knows how to grow. I mean, you take a look at, say the higher teams. I mean, I would say like Talon, even, for instance. I mean, they proved it this year. They know how to grow. They got higher. They know how to win when it matters. And so you have to take that into account quite a bit if we're taking a look at a whole season. But if we are just to say, again, we can't imagine how much more they would have grown. So we take a look at, okay, this is what they showed. A little bit of potential here. Like, let's say Izu gets a little bit more consistent. Sure, that's great. But I would say, with the Neon and things like that, and the way that SPG was willing to innovate the meta, I think SPG would still have a bit of that curveball edge. So I give SPG the edge here against T1. Team Secret. Okay, so if this was Team Secret in Split 1, I don't think I would have given it much thought. I would have given SPG the edge. Of course, we do have to take into account they've always been a good anti-team, and that's something that people think people can use to target SPG. I mean, SPG eventually got antied on things like their bind in Challengers Korea, so they fell off. However, the way SPG countered that was with a 7 map pool. Or in Challengers Korea, a very, very healthy 6 map pool. So SPG they're not going to fall over just because they get antied like in one place, but Team Secret did have that. However, you add in Coach Dummy, you bring in players like Wild Oreo and 2GE, this team suddenly looks a lot better. I would say with the anteing, and I would say Wild Oreo is a type of Sentinel where I look at it and I'm like, SPG could barrel in, and I would still count on Wild Oreo like averaging out over 1 kill per round. You know what I mean? Like per defense. Like even if he's on his own, he's always taking at least one with him. That's how I see it. And then, I would say 2GE started to gain a lot more confidence as the split went on this year in Split 2. I mean, Envy, we don't even have to mention that. Envy, one of the best initiators we have, especially flash initiators that we have in Pacific. And Jeremy has a mental block still very clearly, like we saw it even in the playoffs and things like that. So yeah, I guess you argue that he's inconsistent, but in a just regular best of 3, he still performs. His op came back with confidence, and I would say that he plays a lot of the explosive type duelists like the Raze. So I would say that I still rate Jeremy pretty highly on average. It's just that, like, in the deciding moments, I would say that I'm always concerned about the mental block that he has. But Jesse Vash had, some of the best highlights we've seen from him this year, even compared to last year. So overall, this team is pretty stacked, but then they have a little bit more layers. They're a bit more proactive. Their defaults are a bit quicker on the rotation, and their antis have gotten even, have grown, right? They've continued to add on top rather than kind of demolish and start from scratch. And so with that, I think all of those strengths work actually in favor against a team like SPG. And I think this is the first team where I would look at it and be like, no, I would definitely favor Team Secret, right? T1, I would be like, it's a bit of a coin flip. But Team Secret, I would be like, I think Team Secret actually takes the win against SPG for sure. What does that mean for the rest of the teams? Do I think SPG is losing against all of them? Well, I think they get at least one more win. And I hate to do this against my Indo bros, but listen, SPG already beat one Indo team. I'm sure they could beat another. No, the thing is RRQ, the reason I rated RRQ slightly higher than Team Secret is, yes, sure, there's a little bit of bias just because I'm an RRQ fan, but I would say on top of that, I think RRQ was willing to innovate a bit more, willing to try to get ahead of the meta just a bit more, have a bit of that interpretation of the meta, whereas Team Secret, I think, was better at working with the fundamentals they have and using it to adapt towards their opponents, right? Kind of like a gen.g style of interpretation, whereas RQ was, I guess, slightly closer to Talon, although Talon's like way further on the innovation factor. And with that, I would say that SPG are innovators themselves, so I don't think that's going to necessarily catch them off guard. SPG is very good at adapting on the fly. I would also say that RQ is still struggling to find their own identity, and the reason I say this is, for instance, Jemkin to me is a duelist who likes to try to play perfect, clean Valorant, right? He wants to make the perfect play in any given situation. Not saying it's a bad thing, but you have to be, the team has to have that identity as a whole. Meanwhile, players like Elmimore, a bit more like, hey, like I'm gonna go out and take these guys out from behind like within the first 20 seconds, and that's gonna be how we throw this curveball, even on rounds that you don't need to do that. And so there was a bit of that mismatch on like how proactive is good, right? What's the limit testing we do here? And I'm not saying Jemkin doesn't have the X factor. I mean, you leave him to his own devices, whether it's like a clutch situation or something like that. He is mechanically skilled to be that X factor, but he's not like Buzz on DRX, right? Buzz is the type of the guy that looks at a game and he says, if I don't do the craziest thing 4 rounds in a row, we're not going to win. And so I'm going to do the craziest thing. Like, this should lose us the game, but this is also the only way we win, right? He goes through all the simulations of Doctor Strange and he figures it out. Whereas Jemkin is like, yeah, but that's like, again, this is how I see it from the outside, but the feeling I get is Jemkin looks at it and says, well, that's like the wrong play. And so I'm going to do the right play. But if the entire team isn't doing the right play, sometimes that's not the best play, right? So there's a bit of that mismatch. I would also say that Elmimore, a bit inconsistent, a little different from Jeremy. Like, Jeremy's very much on Team Secret, is very much a push comes to shove, do or die time. Can you do it? And he's like, well, no, this is the match where I can. Whereas Elmimore, kind of an inconsistent player, a bit of a slow starter, things like that. And I would say Estrella also is a bit lacking on the firepower department. Let's be honest. I mean, sure, he's IGLing, but again, we're seeing that become less and less of an excuse. So I do think RQ is a team that SPG could win a best of 3 against. Then what about Talon? Listen, I got to give him the edge. First of all, I am going to say I was a little disappointed about Talon's champion run. I mean, it's not even about the result. It's just the way the games went, right? After the initial kind of hurrah against Leviathan, they started to fold over, and they didn't really get to show us much. Granted, they didn't have many chances. But you still have a player like Primi, who's just absolutely cracked. I would say Ban, was fairly consistent in showcasing his own mechanical prowess. Jip Boys is such a reliable anchor / controller. And then you have Cruz, who's, I think, I still rate pretty highly. I think his mid rounding is still pretty solid, and his round around adjustments. And then you have Governor, who is inconsistent, but as the team has said openly before, and Frost has talked about it even when Governor present on like Spike Talk and stuff, where it's a lot of the times Governor kind of having the things that I see in Buzz, where he's like, well, I need to make this play. Like, this is how we win. This needs to happen. And then whether it's a comms breakdown, whether they're not calming, whatever it is, the synergy isn't there. And then it's Governor that kind of ends up looking like the fool. And so I'm willing to give him a little bit more benefit of the doubt, because I rate that highly. I rate that type of mindset in a duelist and an entry player very high. And I would say that at their best, Talon Governor looked pretty good. Also very, very solid on the Neon. So even in the current meta, I don't think Talon would have faltered. And I think these two teams, like, it would have been bonkers, right? Because the innovation they have and the interpretation they have is pretty crazy. But I would argue that Talon has a bit more anteing. Like, I don't think SPG has really strong, really strong ante. I think they had a bit better ante at Ascension thanks to Coach Sungmin, I would assume. Again, assumptions on the roles. But I'm willing to give Talon the edge here. When it comes to the top 3, listen, SPG look great, but I'm not saying that they can't win. I actually think SPG could win against DRX or Paper X. I think a team like gen.g, they kind of falter against, actually, as soon as gen.g figures it out, right? If gen.g has a little bit of tape, I think the firepower, the individual prowess, etc., Gen.g would be a stalwart wall against SPG. I know Gen.g had a very disappointing Champions run, but you take a look at overall how they've been playing. I don't think you can count that too hard against them. I don't think you can take away too much. Now, DRX played a lot better, but I would say a lot of that was off the back of Buzz. So that's why I'm fine with Gen.g still being my top team of 2024 Pacific. But I would say like DRX, SPG could actually probably beat. But DRX is no stranger to W Gaming, right? I mean, some of the younger guys are, but they're no stranger to it. And I think Buzz's firepower, like Buzz's explosive decision making, would be too strong. This is one where I would actually maybe someday I would reconsider this to be like, actually maybe SPG would beat DRX in a best of 3. But DRX also grew so much throughout Champions. I think that we have to count for them, right? Gen.g faltering, I don't think we take away too much, but DRX's growth, again, a lot of it off the back of Buzz, but would be huge. Also, similar to what I said about Wild Oreo, I would say Flashback is a guy where I'm like, he's always taking one with him, no matter how fast SPG strikes him. So I think SPG would struggle to win. Again, doesn't mean that it's impossible, but I would say that if I had to do my predictions, I would predict the top 3 to beat SPG. Well, quickly then, since originally they weren't part of this video, but since Boom has been promoted, let's take a quick look. What do I think is going to happen with Boom? Do I think they can beat DFM? Okay, I just want to say this. Boom played their best Valorant in the finals against Prisa Gaming. I mean, there's no doubt, like the best that we've seen from them, right? All of them took turns really carrying the team for enough rounds for the rest of the team to kind of regroup and regain confidence. Like the best Valorant I've seen from them this year. There's just end of story. I can't expect them to play like that every match against the VCT Pacific teams. I just can't, right? Some of you are going to be coming in here and be like, wow, you're giving DRX, you know, a little bit of credit because of their growth, and then boom, you're like, wow, they didn't grow. Well, it's one match in a very, very dramatic moment with the crowd behind, like everything was there for Boom, and they made it work. I'm not saying it was luck, but it had to be the full force of BOOM Esports for that one match to happen, and then you still lost. Granted, on another day, the result could be different, but at the end of the day, you lost, right? Like, it was close. I'm not taking that away from you. But if it was like that and then you won, it'd be like, okay, well, maybe now they grow off of that. Like, you see what I'm trying to say here? Listen, by the way, if any Indonesian fans want to come in here and be like, well, you're biased against BOOM Esports, that's unfair. That's crazy, because I'm one of the few people that expected them to get to the grand finals. And also, if you haven't heard, apparently there's some hidden DNA in me that's part Indonesian, because I just really like RQ and BOOM Esports. So who knows what's going on there. But I'm just saying, objectively speaking, everything went right for BOOM Esports, and the players were able to garner that perfection, the perfect storm, to bring out the best. But that was the best. I mean, it was SPG's best too, but SPG was consistently pretty high up there, and then they like went one step higher, whereas Boom was like here, and then they were like bam, right? And then they kept up with SPGs. Just a disclaimer. I still think they could beat DFM. I think it would be very messy though, because if May starts to play up to tempo, I think that's where Boom falters a little bit. Now, I think Boom actually, I will give them that credit. I think they grew in that aspect throughout Ascension, where they were like, hey, we're playing too slow. We got to keep up pace. And that's good. And they've admitted that they were too behind on the meta this time, and that wouldn't happen again. So yeah, okay, we'll give them a little credit. I think could get a little messy. I think May could do a lot of damage. Like if Boom starts off slow, right, then I think May could be like all DFM needs to roll over them. But I would say as a team, Boom look way more coordinated. I would say Boom have more fail safes, of course, because DFM doesn't really have any other than May. So I'm willing to give Boom the win here. ZETA. Oh. Hold on. You see, with ZETA, I can see a world where ZETA wins, actually. Listen, because I can't escape the greatness that Boom showed in the finals, so I'll give them the edge, but I don't know if Boom's gonna play up to tempo every time if their opponents don't, right? They say they will, but like I'm not that faithful. They grew, but I'm not that faithful. But I will say again, there's more players that can step up to 11, I think. While ZETA still, it's mostly Dep and sometimes Laz. So I'll give them that edge. But when it comes to GE, I think the firepower, you're simply ahead. GE is not a fast-paced team either, so Boom would always be prepared for the skirmishes, which is their strong point. So I think they are favored there. Bleed is where I think things get a little iffy, but I'll give Boom the edge just because I think the teamwork would still be in favor of Boom. Bleed was still a little haphazard even when they were playing more confidently. But I think, let's say their team chemistry actually grew if the roster had stuck together and the team stuck together or stayed, then I think Bleed could actually beat Boom. However, starting from here on out, I don't think Boom is a team that can consistently, confidently beat the rest of these teams. And here's why. I mean, let's take a look at the characteristics that we talked about briefly for these other teams. But it's just this matter of, like, T1, great at skirmish. T1's kind of, in my opinion, just a higher Boom Esports. Team Secret, a little bit similar, right? And then I would say RQ, a bit of a better grasp, a bit more patient, right? And I think this would actually just get really muddy, I think. But I think RQ would kind of stay ahead. I think Jemkin would be the one, actually, that's the deciding factor in this matchup. And then, I mean, the top four, similar reasons. I mean, if SPG can't beat him, I can't imagine that Boom's beating him. So that's how I would rate them. Boom's trickier to rate just because the finals, in my opinion, was such a different form that I've seen from them from any of the other matches. And that could have unlocked something in them. I hope it does, but that's a lot of hypotheticals. But I would say that, I think Boom could still, they could escape the bottom rungs, basically. I think. So overall, that would mean that SPG, I would rank like somewhere, maybe like 6th or something like that, right? So, we'll give them something like that. Whereas Boom Esports, maybe something like 8th, right? SPG kind of depends on what the matchups, right, and the bracket looks like here. But Boom Esports, I would say, just barely escaping the bottom rungs, so the bottom third. And then goes up, which I think is still higher. But honestly, if they didn't play like that in the finals, I would have just put them right around 10th and 11th. I think I would have put them similarly to DFM and ZETA. But just because they did show that what they can do, I'm giving them that credit. And I would say that they can hang around a little bit higher. I think I'm going to be honest, I think I'm slightly overrating Boom here if they were to just play up against these other teams. But like, these teams are so messy. They just have such clear things that are lacking, despite some of the good individuals that they have, that I'm willing to give Boom a bit of an edge here. Well, that's just a quick look at what I think would have happened if these teams were playing up against the Pacific teams as they existed at the end of the season. Obviously, Roster Mania is kicking off. Things are already going crazy. We're already missing a team, and Boom Esports has moved up. Things are all out the window, but this is just a little bit of fun theorizing. We'll revisit this as the rosters start to settle in and think, okay, how does this match up? And maybe we see some of these at the off-season tournaments, and now we get a better update on what these teams look like. But if you watched one of, if not the greatest grand finals ever in VCT, let me know, how do you think those two teams, Prisa Gaming and BOOM Esports, will do against the Pacific teams? Let me know down in the comments below, and next time we'll probably be updating ourselves on a little bit of the roster changes happening in VCT Pacific. Until then, I'll see you next time.